What's up, dudes? It's me, Josh. I'm back. But before we get into today's topic, I just want to thank Mr. Z for letting me back on here for a second time. I loved being able to make my last collaboration with him a few months ago, so I'm thrilled to be back here again to talk about today's topic. So, the year is 1700, and the dominant power in India for the past couple centuries has been the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire was an Islamic empire based in what's today India and Pakistan. The empire was founded in 1526 by a man named Babur, who is actually a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, hence the similarity between Mongol and Mughal. Anyways, the Mughals managed to conquer a large amount of India, built magnificent architecture such as the Taj Mahal, and created a centralized government. But by the end of the 17th century, they had begun to decline for a number of reasons, including how their government became ineffective, their religious policies against Hindus pissed off a massive amount of the population, and they kept pouring money into pointless wars. Never seen that one before. The Mughals' ineffective ruling, and many of their unpopular policies regarding their religion, led to many revolts happening across the country. The most important of these revolts would be that of the Marathas, who rose up out of the Deccan Plateau region. The Marathas' intense warrior spirit gave them the strength to conquer most of the subcontinent, defeat the Mughals, and essentially turn them into vassals. Let's rewind a bit, back to the year 1498. Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama had just reached India on his voyages, and Portugal began establishing trading outposts along the Indian coast in order to help them dominate the spice trade. Over time, many other European powers, including Britain and France, also saw the benefit of creating small coastal colonies in India and established their own. The British East India Company would be established in 1600, and they would manage the trade and policy in India. For a while, these trading outposts didn't particularly amount to much, but then the 7 Years' War happened. The 7 Years' War, for the, two of you who don't know, was a global conflict largely between Britain and France, which saw them fight in Europe, as well as in many of their colonies, including India. The 7 Years' War would last, 7 years. Gee, how could I have figured that out? And Britain's engagement in India during the war would start them on the road towards their complete conquest of the subcontinent. The British East India Company would end up ruling over India for about 100 years, until the British Crown took over the colony itself, which they held until the end of World War II. But what if the British weren't able to colonize India? As inevitable as the British domination of India may seem, it actually wouldn't take much to completely prevent their conquest. The one pivotal point at which the British colonization of India could have been prevented was during the Battle of Plassey. The Battle of Plassey was a battle that the British East India Company waged against the then Mughal-controlled Bengal in 1757 during the 7 Years' War. Despite having a great superiority in numbers, plus having the French backing them, the Bengalis made multiple terrible mistakes that would lead to their defeat. Most notably, during the battle, a heavy storm came, which would end up completely wrecking their equipment since they forgot to protect them from the rain. The British, who were able to keep their equipment safe, were then able to press their advantage and defeat the Bengalis and ultimately take the entirety of Bengal. So, all that we would need to change is that the Bengalis managed to protect their equipment from the rain. If they played their cards right and used their superior numbers to their advantage, Bengal could certainly have defeated the British during this pivotal battle. After facing such a humiliating defeat at the hands of Bengal, the British government, who had always been opposed to the East India Company's efforts at creating a land empire in India, would have put their foot down and ordered an end to whatever shenanigans they were getting themselves into. Now, I already know what you're thinking. What about the French? With the British not making any more attempts to colonize India, wouldn't the French see this as an opportunity to take it for themselves? But the thing is, the French East India Company, much like France itself at this point, was hopelessly in debt and actually ended up being abolished a few years after the 7 Years' War ended, so they were not in the state they would need to be in if they wanted to make any such attempts. So without the two dominant European powers trying to conquer the area, India would largely end up being left to its own devices. So what would an independent India during this time period look like? Well, generally things would have kept going in the way they already had been. The Marathas, who were well on their way to conquering most, if not all, of the Indian subcontinent, would have easily become the dominant power in India. The Marathas were basically what you would get if Prussia and nuclear Gandhi had a love child, meaning they were obsessed with war and didn't care who the hell they obliterated along the way. So, with these dudes now controlling India, they would rule the place quite a bit differently from the British. As you could probably infer from my previous analogy, the Marathas had a strong history of conquest, leading them to put much more of an emphasis on war than development. Them being Hindu would also make them much more popular among the general populace of India than either the British or the Islamic Mughals, meaning the only problem they could really face would be, well, just too much war. So now, with the Marathas controlling pretty much all of India, they would most likely just keep doing what they've been doing literally since the day they started. Waging war, conquering as much land as possible, and maybe committing a few dehydrations along the way. They would probably try to conquer lands in what's today Pakistan, Afghanistan, and probably a decent amount in Southeast Asia, but I can't really see them conquering much more than that without overextending themselves and collapsing. It's hard to say just how long the Marathas would end up staying in power, as India had always been a pretty divided region. Maybe about until the end of the 19th century, but even then that's kinda pushing it. Outside of India, things would start to change pretty drastically. Since Britain wouldn't have had to worry about maintaining a strong presence in India, this meant that they would be able to devote much more of their resources elsewhere. However, with Britain losing as major of a revenue source as India, this would mean that their other colonies, such as Australia or Canada, would need to start picking up the slack if the British wanted to be anywhere near as powerful as they were in our timeline. The American Revolution would still break out in this timeline, and although at first I thought the British would have a much better chance at winning, this really wouldn't be the case. British actions in India were extremely minor in our timeline, so even if they didn't have India to worry about, they still probably wouldn't have fared all that much better than they did in our timeline, so America still wins its independence. In the rest of the Americas, the many Spanish colonies that existed there at the time would probably still gain independence, largely in the same way that they did in our timeline. The French Revolution would certainly still happen, once again largely in the same way that it did in our timeline, but Britain's lack of control of India could lead to some major differences in the subsequent Napoleonic Wars. See, in 1798, Napoleon was sent on an expedition to Egypt in order to try to screw with Britain's connection to India. However, without a British-controlled India, this never happens. Although the consequences of this campaign in our timeline were minimal, one of the few things it did lead to was the end of the centuries-old Franco-Ottoman alliance. So, if Napoleon never invaded Egypt, this alliance probably would have continued on into the future and could have led to some very interesting new conflicts in the Napoleonic Wars. If the Ottomans decided they wanted to be an actually useful ally, unlike everyone else in Europe, they could be of major support to France during the invasion of Russia. They already had some interest in taking some Russian land, and their close proximity to them could help Napoleon maintain his supply lines, as well as occupying some land around the Black Sea. However, the prospect of the Islamic Ottomans potentially occupying Moscow might end up spooking the Tsar so much that he would be too scared to turn his back on Napoleon in the first place, meaning the Russian campaign may not ever happen in the first place. So, whether the Russian campaign ends up happening or not, Napoleon would end up retaining his control over Europe. They would end up in a heated rivalry with the British, what else is new, and could probably maintain control over Europe for around a century or even longer. As for the rest of Asia outside of India, without the British controlling India, and thus not having access to the poppies there, this means that the Opium Wars wouldn't end up happening. Without these wars to completely humiliate China, the century of humiliation would be much less severe if it would even happen at all. This would mean that the Qing dynasty, which ruled over China at this point in time, would probably be able to maintain a decent amount of stability and prestige, losing some territories, but enduring as a mostly independent entity. Russia might also see their opportunity here and try to take some land in Central Asia, which might end up bringing them into conflict with the Marathas. So, overall, without the British winning the Battle of Plassey and thus not being able to colonize the rest of India, the world would look pretty different from the world we know today. India would come under the control of the extremely war-hungry Marathas and probably conquer a decent bit of land before they would eventually fall from power. Britain wouldn't be quite the empire that it ended up being in our timeline, both on account of Napoleon's victory in Europe and the loss of Indian wealth, but through its control of major colonies in the Caribbean, Canada, Australia, as well as minor colonies in the Pacific, Britain remains as a major global power in heated rivalry with France and the United States. China doesn't end up getting humiliated by the British during the Opium Wars, meaning the Qing dynasty may maintain enough stability to keep them from collapsing just a little bit longer. Well, that's it for today's video. Once again, I want to give a huge thanks to Mr. Z for bringing me back on here. It was real great to do this again. So if you want to see more of my content, make sure to go check out my channel, Josh Sullivan History. And if you want, maybe you can go and subscribe or something. Well, till next time, see ya.